Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast, where we look for insights beyond the headlines to take a practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It's the 28th of October, 2024. Let's dive in. Now, there's a lot we can say about how the global war on terror impacted the American people, the Department of Defense, the military, and the special operations community, not to mention our international partners and the countries that we operated in around the world. But one of the key outcomes from that 20 years of conflict was an evolution in our approach to integrating air and ground assets. How do you incorporate air power with a maneuver force on the ground? And a whole series of TTPs, tactics, techniques, procedures, were developed and refined, usually based off hard lessons learned over 20 years of conflict. Now, with this evolution, a particular community within special operations rose to prominence, and it's the TacP community inside the Air Force. They don't get a lot of love. They don't get a lot of credit. A lot of great jokes to be said about why. But by the end of the global war on terror, they had become instrumental to the conduct of almost every ground operation that America was involved in. Now, to help us learn more about this subset of the special operations community, this one unique tribe within the Air Force, today we're going to be talking to Ethan Brown, a return guest who recently published a book called Visual Friendly's Tally Target: How Close Air Support in the War on Terror Changed the Way America Made War, specifically about the TacP community and how they evolved over 20 years of conflict. Now, Ethan is a former TacP himself, an Air Force veteran. He's also a visiting fellow at the National Security Institute, and incredibly excited to have this opportunity to talk to him and bring the story of the TacP community to you guys. With that, let's get to Ethan. Well, hey, man, good morning and welcome back to the podcast. How you doing today, Ethan?
Man, I'm doing solid. It's a pleasure coming back as always. I've been watching how your program's expanded, man, so I'm really excited to jump back in for another episode.
Really excited to have you here. Now, my understanding is that you have a book coming out soon called Visual Friendly's Tally Target: How Close Air Support in the War on Terror Changed the Way America Made War. And it's all about this weird thing called TACPs. And my understanding from the special operations community is that the TACP is this person who wanted to do cool guy stuff, but didn't have like the genetics or intestinal fortitude to join a real special ops unit. So they joined the Air Force and then signed up to be the bastard redheaded stepchild. Do you agree with that? Yes or yes? What is a TACP?
Yeah, so Tactical Air Control Party is the Air Force's premier air power integration experts. And indeed, when I went through, of course, this is back when it was hard, right? There was no swimming requirement. So the poster child for Air Force Special Warfare is your pararescue or PJs and then your combat controllers. When I first got ready to join the Air Force, went to a recruiter and said, I want the hardest job the Air Force has. And they said, cool, go be a combat controller. You got to do this PT test. I was like, all right, I'm a young, fit guy. Well, everything went fine until they told me get in the pool and swim 25 meters. Well, I grew up in the wilds of Wyoming where the water's frozen most of the year. I couldn't swim. And I was real bummed out, but the recruiter and the special warfare guy who was administering the PT test, he looks at me and says, well, it's cool, man. Just because you hooked to swim, everything else is great. Just go be a TACP. And my recruiter and I looked at this special warfare operator, and we both said at the same time, what's a TACP? And he's like, oh, it's combat control without swimming. So I was like, all right, that's my job. Calling in airstrikes, I'll take it. But the TACP community is it is very much the redheaded bastard stepchild of the Air Force, right? I make a few allusions in volume 1 of this trilogy, trying to explain exactly what TACP is. And it is essentially the story that I've heard told so many times is in 1947, mom and dad, mom being the Air Force, dad being the Army, they got a divorce. And there was a stepchild, is sort of caught in the middle of this, which is the Forward Air Controller or FAC community, which would ultimately evolve into TACP. So we would spend most of our lives living with dad, the Army, getting roughed up, grizzled, chewing tobacco, drinking energy drinks. And then occasionally we have to go back and stay with mom for a little while. Go back to that professional environment, and mom's horrified at what we've become. So we don't really belong in either camp, right? Mm-hmm. But because of the ability to control air power, which is what these books are about, we became sort of this unique entity within the DoD inventory. And as I talk about in these books, the post 9/11 wars was fundamentally the close air support war, and TacPs, along with several other JTAC tribes, they were the fundamental capability of the CAS war. When I get into volumes 2 and 3 of this trilogy, there will, of course, be Army JTACs, and I've got some coalition Bubbas, Germans, Brits, Canadians. Who else I got? I've got a Danish JTAC. But yeah, book 1 is all about TACPs during the Afghanistan and Iraq invasions. And then as the trilogy moves forward, we'll expand from there.
Nice. Yeah, so JTAC, from understanding too, is it's a common term used in NATO to describe a capability that folks have to do air-to-ground integration with airstrikes. But the TACP is a specific community within the Air Force that specializes in that.
Yes, correct. So JTAC, Joint Terminal Attack Controller, is a doctrinal certification. It's ratified by NATO. It originated with DoD, and it is quite literally the legal ability to say the words "cleared hot" over the radio, which authorizes an aircraft to release bombs or, do a gun run, release munitions in some form or fashion. There are quite a few tribes within the DoD and in particular in the special operations community who are able to achieve that Joint Terminal Attack Controller certification. The preponderance of JTACs come from the U.S. Air Force, and the preponderance of those JTACs come from the TACP career field. But as I made a comment a few minutes ago, Army Rangers have JTACs, Army Special Forces, your 13 Fox dudes, they become JTAC certified. So yeah, it's because the post 9/11 wars featured air power integration at such expansive levels, the JTAC capability became fundamentally the most important tool that we used in that war. So, of course, the scope of the tribes expanded to have more JTACs, although regardless of 20 years of expansion, there were never enough JTACs to go out and support all the guys who needed air power. So,
I'll make this comment, then we'll back up a little bit to talk a bit more about what close air support is. But by the time I'd gotten to Afghanistan in 2020, the requirement was if you were going outside the wire, you had to have a JTAC qualified person with you. And at that point, the Green Beret community had actually created our own designator called SOTAC, Special Operations Terminal Aircraft Controller, which basically was a Green Beret who got trained up to be a JTAC. And so on our team, our junior communications sergeant, Jamie, actually went through the SOTAC training, and we had a JTAC qualified Green Beret, even though he was still a Green Beret.
Right.
And again, it was to meet that JTAC requirement for going outside the wire, because as you said, there was never enough bodies from the Air Force to actually fulfill the demand for the skill set. Let's back up a second, because you brought up a great point about how the global war on terror was really defined in a lot of ways by air power integration. And I would absolutely agree that's one of the fundamental characteristics of how we fought GWAT was that use of airstrikes and that close integration of air power with ground forces. Well, let's talk for a second. What is close air support, and how is that mission set different from strategic bombing or deep strike or some of the other types of strike missions that the Air Force does? Because close air support really is unique in the air power world, and it's always played second fiddle inside the Air Force, which goes back to the, bastard redhead stepchild. You're a ground guy focused on the Air Force's secondary mission who works for other branches. So let's talk about what is close air support.
Right. So I've got the manuscript up for the book right now. Right at the very beginning, I make a reference to the doctrinal definition, which is close air support is the integration or the delivery of aerial fires in close proximity to friendly forces requiring detailed planning and integration. So that's kind of this bucket catch-all phrase, although it is taken from doctrine, right? When we think about close air support, especially in the context of the post 9/11 wars, of course, we think airstrikes, right? The iconic A-10 with the Galway 30 millimeter cannon making that burp noise. I make other comments in book 1 about how I grew up in the Call of Duty generation. And, if we get a certain number of kills or we go to the buy station, we can buy the precision airstrike package, right? We hit left on the D-pad, pull up the magic binoculars, and boom, you got an airstrike. And of course, the same concept has been abused by mainstream media, movies, depictions of airstrikes, things like that, right? Air power and close air support writ large is the integration of all of these three-dimensional capabilities that culminates in an airstrike, or as I make the point several times across these books, sometimes it doesn't result in an airstrike. And that's just as important as whether or not you called in a decisive air power engagement to shift the outcome of battle, or the wherewithal and situational awareness of a JTAC prevented fratricide or civilian casualties by advising the ground commander, hey, sir, we should not strike this target. So that's an important distinction that I want to make as I explain what is close air support. In the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, everything under this post 9/11 GWAT umbrella, the DoD and its coalition partners, we were never fundamentally challenged by a peer adversary, right? So we immediately had air superiority from the opening salvos of, in the case of Book One, both invasions, right? We weren't challenged in Afghanistan by any means. We had the ability to do air interdiction, knock out what little air power that Taliban had. There wasn't really a prevalent surface-to-air threat. And in Iraq, we went in so fast with so much firepower that it was just overwhelming force, right? So those examples where aircraft are going in and bombing these precision targets ahead of a ground force, that's sort of an example of air interdiction and what we think of maybe within that strategic bombing mindset. But close air support is that one guy, typically an Air Force TacP or combat controller, but as you mentioned, in the later years of the war, we saw SF JTACs, we saw Ranger JTACs. Most of our coalition partners pull their JTACs from their Army cohorts, right? Close air support is that one dude out forward with a team, with a platoon, with a company, talking to those aircraft in the skies overhead, building that situational awareness for his supported ground commander, and enabling the maneuver force to shoot, move, communicate, and achieve those ground commanders' objectives for the mission because it provides that situational awareness. Again, we weren't fundamentally challenged at an operational or strategic level because we were fighting adversaries against whom we had overmatch. So we were able to achieve that dynamic that, as I say, this was the CAS war because we immediately had air superiority. We immediately had that ability to provide that precision fires and situational awareness. And very quickly after the two invasions had concluded and we transitioned to the next phase of operations, everything came down to having a JTAC out forward. Even the ISR architecture, the superstructure of persistent surveillance, the intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance collection, you still had to have people out forward controlling the airspace where these aircraft were in perpetual collection mode, right? So as this trilogy moves forward, we're going to see how in the story JTACs became ubiquitous with literally everything above, more than 6 feet off the ground. So close air support, to answer your question, what is CAS? It was everything that flew, and it was controlled by a very small group of people from very narrow, specific career fields, mostly within the Air Force, but in the later years, we had everybody getting into that JTAC pie.
Yeah. Let's talk about what specifically these TACPs, these JTAC qualified people that are doing, what capability they're providing. Because going back to my second lieutenant training days in the infantry, calling in airstrikes, calling in artillery strikes, planning for that stuff, that's like bread and butter in just regular Army infantry. And when I moved from a rifle company to a heavy weapons company later in my life, before switching over to special forces, it was on our mission essential task list that you had to be able to do air to ground integration without any attachments. And then moving into special forces, you're out there in small teams everywhere. So that ability to integrate air power quickly and rapidly, that's like your only saving grace if shit hits the fan. The fact that you can call for emergency close air support and you have two F-15s screaming overhead in 15 minutes, and you only have like 12 minutes of station time, probably, depending on where you are in Afghanistan. But you can get a couple of 500 pounds bomb dropped on whatever problem you have right now and at least give you an opportunity to maneuver. Like that's one of your biggest risk mitigations, that and the golden hour medevac. And we were trained through and through on how to do all of that stuff independently. And as the ground force commander who's ultimately responsible for that. So what is it specifically about this TacP knowledge base and this specialization and the air to ground integration that makes what you guys do so valuable to a ground force commander beyond what that ground force commander has already been taught in their career field up to that point?
Right. And the example you give, you're absolutely 100% right, especially, again, later years of the war, everybody everyone who deployed had a functional understanding of close air support. And as you mentioned, that integration of air power in some capability. Very quickly after the invasions, we ended up establishing these super FOBs. You know, you had large bases like Bagram, we had Nangarhar, Kandahar, Jalalabad and Nangarhar. So at no point was there never not a JTAC qualified person somewhat involved in that kills chain. Even, you know, in your case, if it was an SF team out forward, unsupported by a JTAC, somewhere back at a higher echelon of command, there was a JTAC who was at least tracking to make sure you guys would get the support that you needed. But as you said, everybody fundamentally knew what CAS was and had some familiarity with it. So what distinguishes what TACPs and combat controllers who are JTAC qualified, what distinguishes those individuals from, say, your broader riflemen is when a TACP goes through their selection and pipeline training, this is all they train to do. And later on, they add the basic rifleman skills because they're expected to embed with an Army rifle platoon, right? So you don't want to be the Air Force guy that can't shoot his gun, of course, right? But the difference is you have infantrymen who trained and understood at that very basic functional level how to read off a 9-line, how to pull grids and give it to the pilot who would assume, or the ground commander would assume responsibility for that bomb. The TACPs fundamentally understand every single component to that airstrike, from what the bombs do at a physics-based level, what the brevity terms do. You know, part of the struggles I've had with writing these books is you and I can sit here and have an acronym-laden conversation, right? And I can say ABC, and to you, that might convey an entire conversation. Well, even if I was sitting there as an active duty JTAC with other members of the military, and if another JTAC was there, he and I could have that acronym-laden conversation, and even the other military folks wouldn't have a clue what we were talking about. So what I've struggled with in these books, and why it's taken me 5 years of working on these manuscripts to get the first one ready, is I had to interpret what all of this very myopic, nuanced data means in an application setting. So that difference is that TACP lives and breathes all those air power capabilities and trains how to integrate those to be most effective in supporting the ground commander. There's a good example. So my last 5 years of active duty, I was with 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment as an Air Force JTAC embedded with a rifle company. And I had a young Ranger come up to me, and we had a bit of a rivalry with the Ranger JTACs, but we were all very tight-knit. So we didn't really see much of a difference between, oh, he's an Army JTAC, or these are the 17th STS Air Force JTACs, right? It was a very, very tight-knit group of dudes. But I had a young Ranger private come up to me not long after I had shown up at 3rd Bat, and one of my Ranger JTAC bros was in the room with me, and he's like, "Hey, Sergeant Brown, I got a question. Like, what's the difference between you and the Ranger JTAC sitting next to me?" And I was like, "Well, man, it goes like this. I won't disclose the guy's identity, but we'll call the Ranger JTAC Tim, right? Here's the deal, man. Tim grew up in the Army, and he understands the nuances of being a rifleman. So he understands you being a Ranger, because they all start as Rangers and then they go to their specialties. So he added that JTAC capability, fundamentally understanding how to maneuver and shoot as a rifleman. Whereas with me, I fundamentally understand the aircraft and the bombs and all of the radio and targeting capabilities. And then I had to learn how to be a rifleman on top of that. So it's not that there's a better way of going about it. It's just that it's the methodology and the approach of how TACPs are developed compared to how Green Berets evolved their fires program to incorporate JTACs, or how the Ranger Regiment incorporated their own JTACs, right? So TACPs have just been doing it the longest out of all the communities, just because it's what we were created to do.
Yeah. Well, one of the two things really left an impression on me, because I was a super nerdy guy. I dug into the manuals. I wanted to understand everything about every process and procedure. Yep. When I was in high school thinking about joining the Army, I had an old Marine who was a teacher in my school say, "Hey, it's one thing you can do as an officer. Make sure you can call artillery. Make sure you can drop bombs. If you learn nothing else, learn that." I took that to heart. And when I finally got to Special Forces, two things made a huge impression on me about why I needed to have a JTAC with me if and when going outside the wire in GWAT. It was one, actually talking to y'all and learning about weaponeering, which I'll ask you about in a second. And then two, it was a story our battalion commander told us as part of our pre-deployment training from when he was an investigating officer about an incident where a group of Green Berets actually dropped a bomb on themselves. And these guys have been out on like a 72-hour patrol, hadn't slept. They were pushing partner force, so they're hurting a bunch of Afghans, which is its own treasure. And they get into a gunfight, and the team is split up going through a valley. They've got elements in the village. They got elements on a ridge line adjacent to them and elements on the other side. And elements on one of the ridge lines causing contact. And they're getting into a gunfight. And the ground force commander's in the center of the village, which where he should have been. But he wasn't directly connected to the folks in contact. So he was getting information from his guys. Calls in emergency close air support. They didn't have ISR overhead at the time. And so Air Force responds with the duty close air support platform, which at the time, for whatever reason, was a B-1 bomber. They send in Bone. And I'll ask you a bit about which aircraft are and are not suited for close air support and why it is a specialized mission inside the Air Force. This B-1 bomber was tasked to do ECAS that night, flies overhead, and ground force commander goes through regular deconfliction procedures, has his guys turn on their IR strobes. He can see them. He calls up to the aircraft. The aircraft's looking down from 14,000 feet or 10,000 feet. It was above 7, and that's important we'll get to in a reason. Calls down from altitude, says, yep, I see elements in contact. Nope, I do not see strobes. Distance and direction lined up. Dropped a bomb on a ridge line where they saw enemy contact. Turns out that was the friendly position. They get up there. I think 4 Americans died. When they got up there, one of them was still alive, bent in half, screaming his head off. They pumped him full of morphine. He expired. And later on, it comes out the problem was that the B-1 aircraft, who was tasked with close air support, they didn't actually have any equipment on the bird that was designed to do CAS. All they had for air-to-ground deconfliction was a set of night vision goggles that the pilots were wearing and looking out the rails. And the problem there is above 7,000 feet, those goggles can't see the IR strobes, which immediately I went out and got rid of the IR strobe that I was issued, the little Firefly thing that we use for free fall jumping. I got the big old green big strobe on the back of my helmet that I could get. Right. Because as the GFC, I'm going to know where my guys are and the aircraft's going to see me, goddammit. But yeah, followed all the correct procedures as far as knew it, but just didn't know to ask the follow-up questions like, hey, what are you actually carrying on that B-1 to do air-to-ground deconfliction? What pod are you flying? Didn't know to ask those questions. Didn't know that it was possible for the Air Force to show up with a bird for emergency close air support. And obviously, it's emergency close air support. You get what you get. Right. Didn't even know it was possible to deal with those issues. But from a TacP perspective, you guys know all those contingencies.
Yeah, there's maybe a better and more expansive answer to, what does the TacP provide? A lot of it comes down to the equipment and, frankly, just knowing how to use it. There's an example I give, and it's a warning story. Every JTAC, when they go through their qualification training, we've all heard this story. And it's covered in a separate book, several separate published items. It was December 2001. It was the bomb strike that nearly killed Hamid Karzai, right? This guy was going to be the future of Afghanistan, and those amazing U.S. Army Special Forces teams were escorting him. They were going to liberate Kandahar. Hamid Karzai was going to be the guy to come in and rebuild this war-torn country. And God bless those Green Berets who were out there literally living the worst possible conditions, no sleep, constant push south. And they had Air Force, at the time we were called E20s with them. But you talk about equipment from your example, this B-1 showing up, without all the typical equipment that we got used to later in the war. At the time, early 2001, this was the first time that these GPS-guided bombs called JDAMs, Joint Direct Attack Munitions, had ever been utilized in any sort of serious combat, right? They weren't designed for close air support. Although, I dropped hundreds of them myself as an active duty JTAC, and I, every JTAC has dropped their JDAM if they've been in combat. But the bombs weren't designed for that. Those were an air interdiction tool meant to have the grid plugged into the GPS guidance kit and the aircraft is in some form of a standoff, and those bombs are thrown from miles away, and they vector directly to that precision grid as it's taken from imagery, from mensuration software, things like that. Well, the example I give, I tell this story in as much detail as I was able to acquire through investigations and primary and secondary sources is the ETACs were supporting the ODAs, helping the Pashtun militias push south towards Kandahar. And he was using a device called the PSN-11 plugger. It's this green brick with a big ugly antenna sticking out of it, which was the GPS of the time, right? What you and I would be more familiar with is the PSN-13 Dagger GPS. Everybody knows their Dagger, right? So I'm kind of going to share some cool historical, like how we got to the equipment we had later on in the war. Well, this ETAC was helping call in airstrikes around Tarankout, help it, getting the battlefield ready for the Pashtun militias to push forward. And he's using this 100-year-old Russian map, trying to project waypoints to figure out where these spots on the ridgeline are, using his PSN-11 plugger. And wouldn't you know it, the batteries die. So doing what he does, he gets new batteries, he throws them in, and he pulls the grid off the thing, and he passes it to a B-52 floating around 18,000 feet. The weapons officer on the B-52 plugs in the grid as directed by the ETAC, and a 2,000-pound bomb lands, I want to say it was about 41 meters away from the future president of Afghanistan. Tragically, as I recall, it killed 2 Green Beret soldiers, harmed several others. It was a whole thing, right? Well, number one, we had never used these GPS-guided bombs in combat. The first effective application, as I cover in Chapter 2 of this book, was Special Forces teams with their embedded Air Force ETACs in the north calling in these JDAM airstrikes to break the Taliban's hold in northern Afghanistan. And then these guys down south are trying to replicate the same TTPs. Well, when the batteries died on that PSN-11 plugger, the grid that immediately popped up once he repowered the system was his location.
Yep.
When we get to the PSN-13 Dagger years later, if you'll recall, when you power that thing up, the very first message on that receiver says, warning, grid displayed is user's location, not last projected waypoint. The whole reason that software was written to show that warning message was because of the incident that nearly killed Hamid Karzai. And all of the situational awareness tools that we would have later in the war, we were running around with, I got to use the right terminology here, with secured smartphones strapped to our chest plates, and we could pull up imagery and moving map. All of that can trace its lineage back to that incident where the plugger died. The wrong grid was passed to the B-52s, who did not have sensor pods at the time. They're just plotting grids in their Falcon View software. And in fact, the final chapter of book 1 is talking about the development of the first generation of situational awareness tools because of that incident. So it's really, I tie a bunch of loose threads together into this tapestry. But, we talk about everything that we knew in later years of the war, like my generation, you and I kind of worked, deployed around the same times, our later generations, we had all of these situational awareness tools, and every fast moving aircraft had a sniper pod with high resolution imagery. We had RPAs flying at all hours of the day and night. But back when we invaded Afghanistan, dudes were using paper maps surveyed by Russians 100 years prior. Those grids were hundreds of meters off, and these guys they just made it work. That's what the JTACs and specifically the TacPs were, the guys who developed these TTPs, unfortunately through some very difficult lessons learned, right? And one thing I want to make clear, and I address it multiple times in the book, is that there's a public misconception about air power in the post 9/11 wars. It's that JTACs were out there raising villages, scorched earth, leveling entire, battle spaces. And that simply was not the case. Every airstrike that every JTAC called in was carefully vetted. And the JTACs themselves, there was a comment you made earlier, and I want to come back to it and reintroduce it here. The ground commander is ultimately responsible for those bombs.
Yep.
He depends on the JTAC to be the subject matter expert, the tactical and technical expert, to achieve his intent. So that JTAC takes the guidance from the ground commander. Hey, JTAC, my guys are taking fire on that ridge line. I need you to deal with that. The JTAC is the guy who has that situational awareness, has the tools, and even without the tools, still has the ability, is specially trained to know, okay, I've got one squad up on that ridge line. They're moving in this direction. They're moving up on this set of buildings. I've got my element here, but I've also got indigenous forces moving with this element. The battle tracking is really the primary capability that JTACs provide. And that's the special training that they spend years developing after years of training how to do it properly. So really, that's kind of the big distinguishing factor. And, of course, we developed all these tools over a 20-year-long war. But I'll share another story from my time when I was in 375. The battalion commander would go out there when we were doing a live fire lane with a Ranger platoon, and he'd get up there in front of everybody, and he was a very articulate public speaker. And he'd get up there in front of all the platoons of the company, and he'd say, somebody tell me what's the most dangerous thing we do. And, some Ranger sergeant would raise his hand and be like, clearing a compound at night, or, doing a airborne insertion, all these different examples of high-risk activities. And the battalion commander, he'd just shake his head. He's like, nope, the most dangerous thing we do. And then he'd point over at me or the other Air Force JTACs and the Ranger JTACs, all of us, working for him and supporting his ground commanders. He'd say the most dangerous thing we do is call in close air support in close proximity to friendly units maneuvering through a battlefield at night.
Yep.
The responsibility that we carried was immense. And I'm going to say it's hard to explain, but that's exactly what I've tried to do by writing these books. But man, I argue it is the most difficult job that any human being has ever had to do. And, with you having, as you said, you were an effective ground commander in that you wanted to understand the process. So I know you appreciate the nuance to that statement. Being a ground commander means you're responsible for everything. But being the JTAC means you literally have influence over every component of the battlefield and are charged with that responsibility to achieve those ground commanders' intents by applying the most devastating weapons humans have ever developed.
Yeah. No, air power is an incredible tool, but it cuts both ways, and it can save your ass or it can wreck your ass real fast.
Yeah.
And especially as a ground force commander, like you're constantly listening to two different radio nets at once, so you're already pulled apart. I'd have two radios in the front of my kit. I have another radio in my backpack. And being able to offload, just monitoring the air stack and keeping track of it all times and just passing taskings back and forth, because it's a full-time job, to that JTAC or that SOTAC or that whoever, but was incredibly valuable. Because without that, now I'm listening to Command Net, I'm listening to Assault Net on my Peltors, and then I've got an earbud snuck in underneath my Peltors talking to the Fires Net with all the aircraft on it. So you're literally having three conversations at once. Right. And the amount of errors that can happen in that environment just go up exponentially.
Right.
And to your battalion commander's point, by the time I'd gotten to Afghanistan, we had, over a decade's worth of in-depth data from when I actually started tracking stuff on, where do things go well for special operations? Where do things go badly for special operations? And one of the things that they learn is that anytime that special operations are asked to do something in a manner in which they're not accustomed, the chances of something go wrong goes up drastically. And typically that would look like top-down control over a special operations mission, because we're very much, you give us the mission, we go solve it, we tell you how we did it after the fact. Very independently minded. We're built for that. So we just do not integrate direct control very well as a community. The other thing is when you work with people you've never worked with before, and one of the unique things about close air support, especially in an emergency situation where you need it now to solve a problem, is that you are almost by default integrating an organization that you've never worked with before. Because you haven't been talking to that pilot for an hour overhead watching your route. You haven't worked with that unit. You didn't have a chance to go meet them on the tarmac last week and have a couple of beers, rippets, and just develop that rapport and get to know them a little bit. And those intangibles, you don't realize the effect they have until you don't have them. And it does have to be a very tightly managed process. And JTACs are just excellent at taking care of those details, especially because Air Force is very detail-oriented, Army, much less so by comparison.
Well, you bring up a good point, so I'll double down on it here. Just to piggyback on what the commander just said, so much of the dynamic between the JTAC and the ground commander and the whole unit writ large is trust. And you are as a JTAC, you are constantly having to prove yourself to the guys that you're there to support. So there's maybe a misconception. I make a point in the opening pages of the book where there's a certain professional confidence across the JTAC community that sometimes spills over the line into arrogance, but it's this unique ability, as you mentioned, for us to, it doesn't matter what the ground unit is. We understand our role and we can adapt to that. And again, that echoes, that adaptability of special operations in particular. But so much of the ability to call in an airstrike in the heat of battle is based on trust. When a ground commander understands that fundamental capability, that sort of advances the relationship. And as I talk about in this first book, we're learning, the reader is going to see how there weren't relationships between Air Force, JTACs, and Army ground forces, because this is when it was all being developed. The two tribes kind of knew what the other did, but that integration was lacking because we didn't have a war to go fight. The best example or the nearest example would be peacekeeping operations in Bosnia, which didn't have a fundamental CAS role, although air power and airstrikes were a thing in that mid-90s episode. But so much of it comes down to trust. And it requires that TacP or combat controller, or if you're a special forces fires guy or communications sergeant coming back to your team, well, you may still be a guy on the team, but you just showed up with the biggest stick in the human arsenal, right? Like nothing is more devastating than an airstrike, especially when it's controlled effectively. So until that time when you get to the moment of truth and you say cleared hot over the radio and everybody can hear the whistle of 500 pounds of hate coming down, up until that moment when it's successful, nobody knows how this is going to shake out. And I would tell younger JTACs, when I was an instructor before I got out, I would tell these younger guys, look, when you pass final clearance, if your asshole isn't puckered and you're not sweating bullets thinking back over every number you just passed to the aircraft, if you're not terrified when those bombs come off the rail, you need to go find another job, because that fear of messing up, none of us were scared per se, because when you get into a gunfight, you just go to muscle memory. You go to what you were trained to do. But the reality is, this is the most dangerous thing we have ever asked a human being to do, is drop 500 pounds of hate at a time right next to your buddies, or worse, right next to a group of guys that you have barely gotten to know. Mm-hmm. That trust is so important and so fundamental. And there's an example I give, and I think it's original. I'm pretty proud of coining the phrase, but we'll see if anyone calls me out on it. But President Harry Truman used to have a placard that sat on his desk in the White House, and it said, "The buck stops here," right? Meaning I'm responsible for everything. Well, transcribing that to the JTAC ground commander component, the buck stops with the ground force commander, but it gets spent by the JTAC. And again, all that comes down to trust in.
That's a good JTAC way of describing it.
Right? It's a good example, right? Like I said, I'm pretty proud of it. I think it's original. Ground commanders place so much trust in their fires guy, right? And the term JTAC, it's ubiquitous throughout the book, but we can give so many other examples. You have your forward observers, whether they're Army or Marine Corps, who integrate the artillery component, which of course JTACs are also experts in artillery integration. I've got some great examples of that in book one with a National Guard TacP in 2003 in Afghanistan. But man, so much of it comes down to trust. And until that moment when you call in that first airstrike, it's a gamble for everybody. But once that happens, it's like, yeah, that's our JTAC. He saved our asses. But just because you did it right one time, it does not alleviate the pressure of getting it right every other time. We chased perfection, and there's some more examples I give in the book. Even when everything seemed to have gone apparently right, Murphy and his damnable law, it takes over, man. Even when you do everything right, the JTAC he can affect the entire battlefield, but only his sliver of it at a time. And that's, I keep making this point, and I don't want to abuse saying the phrase too much, but there's so much about close air support and integrating it into the ground scheme of maneuver that the broader public just does not understand. And I hope I have addressed that by writing these books.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a phrase in showbiz. It's you're only as good as your last performance. But when it comes to something like airstrikes, you're only as good as the strike you haven't dropped yet.
Yeah.
What you did last time already does, the moment that bomb goes off, it no longer matters. You get no credit for it moving forward. And I remember showing up in country and got a JTAC assigned to us. His name was Steve from the Air Force. Great guy. I love working with him. But he shows up and he goes, "Hey, sir, I'm Steve. I'm your JTAC." I'm like, "That's great." He's like, "So what's your name?" I'm like, "My name's Scott." He's like, "Oh, that's right. You guys don't give it first name." I'm like, "I'm not telling you the rest of my name because I don't want you to have my initials yet." Because passing the initials is what gives authorization for the strike. So, like, exactly. I'm your GFC, but I'm not giving you my initials till I get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah, and a good JTAC will. This was, again, going back to, in my later years, being instructor certified and whatnot. A good JTAC should have the mentality of, I am here to support these ground guys. There'd be a handful of guys, and usually when you join a team of Army, whether it was Ranger, SF, if they had a bad experience with their JTAC, you were going to be the first guy to hear about it. Because they would ask, like, "Do you know so-and-so?" It's like, "Yeah, I know the guy." It's like, "Well, he was our last JTAC, and he did not fit." It's like, okay, cool. I have a whole new mountain I have to climb, right? Because of the mentality, and it's infrequent, but it does, nobody's perfect, where the JTAC might think, "I'm the show, and this Green Beret team is my security detail." And that is the wrong mindset to have. The right mindset, and the one that, I feel like I embodied, and what I always pressed upon, the younger guys on the team is, you are not the show. You are there to support the guys on the ground who are actually kicking in those doors and getting after it with the enemy. So you have to be perfect. If you can't be perfect, you got to be as close to perfect as possible. And every day you got to go re-earn their trust. So one of the, I give plenty of examples in the book of what JTACs did was not just merely sit there playing with their radios, messing with their maps and their GPSs. If their Army guys were going out to shoot, "Hey, we're going out to the range," it's like, "Hey, let me go. Like, I want to go shoot with you guys. Hey, what are you guys getting after this week?" It's like, "Oh, we're doing medical lanes." It's like, "Cool, I'll be there." The JTACs have an inherent responsibility to ingratiate. And that term gets misunderstood by a lot of people, but I truly mean ingratiate themselves with their supported ground guys, Army, Marine, Navy SEALs, it doesn't matter. And that's sort of this unique dynamic to being a JTAC is, again, you don't really belong to the Air Force because the Air Force doesn't understand what TacPs and combat controllers are because we're off living with the Army or living with the Marines. So the JTAC has this inherent responsibility to fully ingratiate himself with his ground guys. And every day is proving grounds for him, regardless of that cool IR JTAC patch on his shoulder, right? None of that matters.
It's not that cool. I've seen a lot. They're not that cool.
Exactly. Yeah. But yeah, so much of it is about relationships and there's that human component. So I'll take this brief aside and kind of narrate how the book trilogy is shaken out. Mm-hmm. With book one, it is a very zoomed out, broad perspective. This is my attempt to just simply explain what is close air support, what are forward air controllers, and what are some of the hugely influential things that this very small tribe did in these opening chapters of the War on Terror. And I didn't even do this on purpose. Originally, this was supposed to just be one book. And as I started pitching this whole project out to publishers and literary agents, I was on the phone with one in particular, and they're like, "Well, Mr. Brown, how many words do you have in the manuscript?" And I was like, "Oh, I've got the document up right now. It's 612 pages on Microsoft Word, single space." And they're like, "Cool, but how many words?" It's like, "Oh, 327,000. They're like, "Mr. Brown, that's not a book. That's a trilogy." It's like, okay, well, shit, I guess I got to publish 3 books then, right? But my intent was to get this all as a one-stop shop. But then as I had to break this up into a trilogy, these 3 books almost became unique, independent components of this greater work. So again, volume 1, very zoomed out, where I try to explain what's a laser-guided bomb and how do you call it in? Like, what's the difference between that and a rocket or an unguided bomb? And I give these individual examples as guys are narrating their experiences of some frankly historic events that people, the public was not made aware of. When I get to volume 2, I really dive into that interpersonal component where I talk with, My former team sergeant was the QRF JTAC who responded to the shoot down of Extortion 17 in 2011. I've got, again, the coalition guys who feature in Volume 2 who give a really interesting perspective as not Americans fighting in the war on terror. So Book 2 was that very interpersonal, how does the mind of a JTAC tick? And then when we get to, when we get to Volume 3, which covers the last few years of the war. So Volume 1 is the invasions. Volume 2 is the surge era. Volume 3 I call Terminus because it's the last 7 years. Volume 3 is really where all the kitty gloves come off and we really start taking swings at the decision-making, the grand strategy or lack thereof, the unclear political outcomes. As we talked about my last time on the show, I referenced my ghost of GWAT theory, talking about societal fatigue and why we're struggling with recruiting numbers. Volume 3 is really an angry dissertation on why we failed to win the war on terror. I don't argue that we lost that war, because if you look at casualty numbers, to borrow a phrase from one of the JTACs I interviewed, man, if you look at the enemy killed, we whooped that ass, right? Yeah. Tragically, we did lose over 3,000 American lives and, many more coalition lives. And of course, the indigenous partner forces, scores of Afghan soldiers died trying to fight for that country. But we didn't lose that war. We didn't win it. So it's these 3 books that take this very unique linear approach, sort of independent of each other to get to the end state. And, it's at the end of this whole explanation, JTACs were involved in literally every single component of this war.
Yeah, definitely looking forward to seeing that 3rd book when it comes out. But real quick, give us an example of a scenario where you had where you had to do close air support in support of ground forces. What was that like? What was the scenario? What was the actual conversation with the ground force commander like? What was calling in the airstrike and all the thought process that went into it? What did you have to work through, or what did one of the people that you interviewed have to work through? What does that actually look and feel like?
There's the example I give is it's not a well-known story, quite tragically. So I get to tell it in my book, which is great, right? It's the Battle of Debeka Pass in April of 2003. Now, people, casual military history enthusiasts or who follow the war on terror are interested in it. They're aware of the big push from Kuwait up into Baghdad, and we had dudes crossing the berm and making that big western hook. I also talk about the seizure of the Haditha Dam by Bravo Company 375 with 2 Air Force TacPs calling in airstrikes. One Ranger company ousted a battalion plus of Iraqis defending the dam, right? That's a crazy story. But the example I'll give here is an Air Force TacP named Lance McGuire, who was embedded with an Army Special Forces team in northern Iraq, embedded with the Kurdish Peshmerga forces. And the Debeka Pass is this terrain feature between Mosul and Erbil and that Kirkuk kind of tri-sectional area, right? And the assumption with intelligence as they're getting ready to invade Iraq was that a third of the Iraqi army was going to stay south and try to delay the advance of the coalition forces moving towards Baghdad, while 2/3 of the Iraqi military was going to move to northern Iraq and sort of be this delay in zone defensive setup to try and just cause as much attrition as possible as the Iraqi state kept moving farther and farther north away from coalition forces. So what did we do? We sent a handful of Army Special Forces teams in with a couple of JTACs and said, there's Iraqi military out there, a lot of them, good luck. So Lance goes out there with his SF team, and they're driving around in a couple of gun trucks, and they've got some of their Peshmerga, and they have to go take this high point on a ridgeline. And there is already an entire battalion of Iraqi armor and infantry, not just waiting, but literally dug into the mountaintop. And you've got this SF team with your holistic weapon systems. You've got some Ma Deuces, you've got some 240s, you've got Indige with AK-47s, and then you've got your own personal panoply of your M4s and whatnot, right?
Yep.
M4s are not going to win a fight against dug-in armor and infantry.
Fake so news. Totally can pull it off.
Right. There's a really cool side story in this chapter where Lance talked about the Green Berets trading fire with the Dishkas, and he explains the range differences. So there's this crazy component where it's like, we knew we could pull up to right here on the mountain because our 50 cals could just outreach the 12.7 millimeter Dishkas. And it's just that little nuance of trying to put us in the context of the story is just, it's so exciting and crazy. So what Lance does is he calls up through the command and control network, and he gets a B-52 on station. He's like, great, I've got targets. So he plots out this long bomb run, and then a couple F-18s show up, and he says, great, I've got targets. So in a matter of a few hours, and previously they had tried assaulting the mountain and kind of getting a feel for what the target would look like. And it was like, all right, cool. Ma Deuce versus Dishka, we'll take that fight, but they've got howitzers, artillery throwing artillery rounds at these unarmored trucks. It's like, all right, we're going to get the JTAC involved now. So in the matter of just a few minutes, Lance's airstrikes wiped a battalion plus off the map. And they drive up to the mountaintop, and there is literally nothing left. So it's this ground commander says, hey, JTAC, I've got this problem, and I need to go get to that mountaintop because we have to be able to control this key piece of terrain. So the JTAC says, roger that, sir. I'm working air support. And they said, hey, you've got a B-52. Great. I've got targets. And it's just his brief summary. And, of course, there's so much more detail in the story of how he got there. I don't want to take too much away from people reading the book. But, I mean, that's just one example of a JTAC doing what he was specially trained to do and fundamentally altering the dynamic of a battle against a numerically superior force, man. It almost beggars belief what we were able to do with this technology. And I use this example frequently throughout all three books, is that we can look back at examples like Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, Napoleon. These were these commanders of armies with strategic decision-making, but none of those examples in history compared to how much power one JTAC had at their fingertips. A JTAC in the global war on terror. No one has had that much power in their hands. And it's so exciting to see how these different examples move forward and how one individual embedded with a small team was able to achieve that kind of influence over a modern battlefield.
Absolutely. Now, when we start thinking about modern battlefields, we're leaving the GWAT era and we're moving into this era of great power competition. You mentioned at the start of the conversation that, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, we were able to roll in and immediately have air superiority. We could fly wherever we wanted. We could drop wherever we wanted. We didn't have EW constraints, electronic warfare constraints. And we,
you can achieve the golden hour rule, as you mentioned right off the bat.
For medevac, So they had the ability to fly unarmed medevac helicopters to within an hour anywhere in country, unopposed. How does the role of a JTAC and how the larger military views the JTAC change when we get into great power competition and we don't have that same air dominance as a given, and we don't have that ability to choose to either get into a gunfight or not get into a gunfight with the enemy, basically at our leisure once you do post-invasion?
Yeah. So I love this question, man. I really do. And I've put thought into it, and it'll get answered in much more explicit detail in volume 3, because that's sort of how I tie all these loose ends up. But I make allusions and examples in all 3 of the books. But, JTACs, GWAT, close air support, all of these acronyms, as we joked about earlier, they all sort of coalesce into this very unique battlefield environment that we spent 20 years fighting in. So the Department of Defense maybe has this genetic misunderstanding that, well, we can only use JTACs in a permissive environment because close air support requires a permissive environment. That's not necessarily the case, because
that's weird, because in World War II, the environment was not permissive, and we did a shit ton of close air support. It's funny how that...
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
No, it's a great example. And I got to give a shout out to a buddy of mine. So I volunteer for the TacP Foundation, which is our community support nonprofit. We have a historian, Nathan Bashand, who, as I've written this trilogy about the post 9/11 wars and JTACs, Nathan has gone back to tell the entire history of the theater air command and control, the TacP genealogy and evolution, going all the way back to World War II. So that'll be a forthcoming for your listeners. We've got more CAS history coming out in future years.
I'd love to have him on to talk about it.
I'll get you guys connected, man. That's an easy kill right there. JTACs in this great powers competition dynamic, and I almost hate saying great powers because that we tend to forget about all of the other threats to the rules-based order. So, now we use the term strategic competition, which is literally everything not counter-terror. But, JTACs still have a fundamental role in whatever that future fight is. And it doesn't necessarily mean passing 9 lines to aircraft to drop one bomb on one target. What JTACs provide more than any other capability in the inventory is situational awareness and command and control. There's an example I give in volume 1. In the introduction, I talk about when CAS went wrong, because I would be remiss if I spent 3 books talking about how cool JTACs are and how great CAS is and, all the great stuff we did in 20 years.
Well, yeah, you're not a Navy SEAL.
Right. Well, I got nothing but love for all the warfare tribes. So, I would be remiss if I went into this project without acknowledging, yes, mistakes were absolutely made. The important thing is the JTAC community, every time a mistake was made, we went back to figure out what went wrong and then made sure everybody understood that at a genetic level. When you take that situational awareness capability off the front line and you try to put it into some remote capability. Now, we managed to do this with kinetic strike cells in the last, say, 8-9 years of the war. And really the fight against ISIS, which I cover in depth in volume 3, featured a lot of kinetic strike. And I want to call out my buddy Wes Bryant wrote the book Hunting the Caliphate. He co-authored that. Lieutenant General Dana. It was Wes Bryant and another author wrote the book Hunting the Caliphate. Talks about the kinetic strike cells against ISIS. I encourage everybody to read it. It's a great book. But, we took JTACs off the front lines because we had to cover so much territory and we couldn't get guys out forward. But in that permissive environment, you're able to do that because you had persistent surveillance with the RPAs everywhere. And we had deployed so many times to these same places and everybody just we had this well-oiled machine with great situational awareness. When we go into those non-permissive environments in the future and you don't have that JTAC capability out forward, you are not going to be able to shoot, move, communicate. You will not be able to perform command and control. There's the proliferation of drones in the modern battlefield. We saw it in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020. We are seeing it at scale in Ukraine. We've seen it between Israel and Iran. JTACs have a fundamental role in the emerging drone cohort of modern warfare. We have always had the radios being able to talk to and relay information with our situational awareness. So when we talk about great power competition, when we talk about strategic competition, future warfare, how combat has evolved, JTACs are not just about calling in a bomb. They are about providing the situational awareness and the command and control to ensure that we can achieve our tactical, operational, and strategic objectives. So I hope that answers your question there on that very complex issue.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an easy thing to break apart and unpack. But as we move forward, what's your sense of how the Air Force as a branch with its own organizational prerogatives and bureaucratic inertia is going to treat the JTAC community? Because we've already seen cuts in special operations on the Army side with civil affairs and PSYOPs and some other communities, right, as we've done this pseudo drawdown post GWAT. But with TacP specifically inside the Air Force, I mean, the close air support mission that the Air Force has, I will cynically say, but with complete confidence, that the Air Force does not care about close air support, has never wanted to do close air support. The only reason why they have the close air support mission is because they didn't want the Army to have an excuse to do fixed wing control to protect their own existence as a branch. And there's plenty, you can argue about it, but there's plenty of history to back that statement up. So with a mission that the Air Force already seems to not care about, and we see it with them getting rid of the A-10 and trying to move everything to the F-35, what do you think the future of an organization like the TacPs are inside that organization? Are you guys sitting where you need to be in the DoD?
I cannot answer this question objectively as a former TacP. So little bit of a grain of salt with my answer, but
I'll take the unobjective truth.
Yeah, the short answer, no. The TacP career field is not being prioritized by the Air Force, and I already mentioned my boy Nate Bashand, who is writing this pre-GWAT history, and the comment you made. There's no arguing that the Air Force took up the CAS role because they just didn't want anybody else to have it, and Nate makes many connections to that, and it goes back as far as Vietnam and Korea, even, right? So that would be a great episode when you bring him on. He's got his PhD in the history of TacPs. That's his bona fides. But no, the Air Force has not prioritized its tactical air control capability. And I suspect this goes back to the misunderstanding or the misconception that all JTACs did is call in airstrikes via 9 lines. When we provide so much more. I made this comment earlier in our conversation about relationships and trust, right? The best thing that came out of the post 9/11 wars, if we're trying to find some silver lining to a dark chapter of our national security history, the best thing that came out of GWAT is this was the first truly joint war. Even if we go back to World War II and you want to look at something like Operation Overlord with Normandy, you had the air planners, you had the maritime naval planners, there was some littoral component with the amphibious assault, and then you had the ground war. You had 3, really, as more than 3, but if we really want to boil this down, the biggest amphibious assault in history, it was disparate components all working in the same linear direction. And we never really achieved joint, even in Vietnam, which I call the helicopter war, because that's the first time we introduced this mobility capability to get people out forward. Desert Storm, we had some joint component that started to emerge. And I actually give one example of CAS in Desert Storm from one of the chapters in volume 1. But man, GWAT was when we really became a joint force because we had to, right? Afghanistan was a landlocked country. Iraq had its own environmental constraints. So as we move forward into the next generation of warfare and developing our capabilities, if you take JTACs and cut their funding, cut their personnel, cut their training opportunities, consolidate them into super units where we no longer have TACPs and combat controllers going out and embedding with our Army brothers, man, the trust dynamic alone that you're going to lose cannot be quantified. It's so important when you're trying to make a functional joint force. And that's something that TACPs have done extremely. I mean, that was our bread and butter was earning the trust of our Army brethren. So that is definitely a huge concern of mine that TACPs and the JTAC capability writ large is falling down the totem of strategic priorities for the DoD and the Air Force, of course.
Well, I appreciate your concern, and I certainly share it on this end of the camera. But hey, we're coming up on our time here. But real quick, Visual Friendly's Tally Target, How Close Air Support in the War on Terror Changed the Way America Made War. I guess Volume 1. We'll see what the other 2 are called. But if people want to check out this book, where do they go find it?
So it drops November 30th. It's available on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. We've got the ebook fired up, so I'm assuming we can get it on Kindle. My publisher's got Casemate Publishers is who's putting the book out for me. Phenomenal. I can't say enough good things about the publisher. They've got it listed on their website. Apparently some folks have already started getting their orders. I think if they order direct from the publisher, so you might be able to get it a little bit earlier. It's been out in the UK since September. So if anybody wants to fly to London, that might be the quickest way to get it. Get an excuse to go take a UK vacation. But yeah, it drops end of November, beginning December. It's available on all your major retailers. I will share this with you, Scott, since we've got some good history. If I'm flying through an airport and I come up on one of those Hudson bookstores and I see one of my books on the shelf, I am 100% going to pull it off the shelf, pop out a pen, and sign that thing. Just ghost signature. Just a fun little nugget for whoever happens to buy that book. So I might have just incriminated myself. If I have to, I'll just buy the book anyway. But yeah, I'm very much looking forward to seeing this come out. I'm excited to share this story with the world. And I also don't want to necessarily take any credit. The books are amazing, but that's not because of me as the author. It's because of these guys who shared their stories. It's stuff that just is too impossible to not be true. And one last point I do want to make. the concerns with all the people I interviewed, I'm over 120 interviewees at this point. Everybody was concerned that when they shared their stories with me, that it was going to be like, man, this is too crazy. Like, no one's going to believe that this happened. And, the banking and jiving with the aircraft. What really happened is, as I transcribed these interviews, I had to take so much material out of these interviews just to make it something that people could sink their teeth into. So there has been zero embellishment. There has been zero elaboration or dramatization. I had to take much of the content out and every word in it to the best of my ability, through primary and secondary sources. There's no fiction in these books. Everything in these books is 100% true and factual. And it's too astounding to not be real. So I'm very excited to share this story with the world.
Awesome. Well, hey, appreciate all the effort you put into that. It's definitely good to proselytize the good work that Special Operations and all its tribe does out there in the world and let people understand what we've been doing for 20 years. So they can make better choices about what they want to send us after next time. Anyway, thanks for coming on today, man. Appreciate your time, sir.
Thanks, buddy. We'll talk next time.